Barrett Shaw couldn't believe his eyes. The boss of the Shaw Syndicate, the man who made Chicago's entire underworld bow, was standing behind a row of trees in a public park, watching his little sister sit on a bench with a stranger. The woman wore a faded shirt and worn-out sneakers, sketching diagrams on a crumpled piece of paper, teaching Kennedy Shaw as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Kennedy was laughing. Barrett couldn't remember the last time his sister laughed like that. He looked closer and recognized her. That woman, the night shift janitor, the same woman who had been sitting in the 40th floor conference room at 2 a.m, reading financial reports that didn't belong to her. The same woman who left behind a sticky note that Barrett had kept in his desk drawer for 3 weeks. But there was one thing Barrett didn't know yet. The woman carried by the janitor from the 40th floor had a mind sharp enough to uncover the hidden numbers that could bring his entire empire crashing down. And the person who wanted her gone from Chicago was sitting in his boardroom every single morning. This is the story of Maren Cole. She had no degree, no family, nothing except a mentally ill mother and a mind the whole world forgot about, until the day she stepped into Barrett Shaw's life and everything changed. If this story touched your heart, hit the like button and share it with someone you care about. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss another powerful story. Thank you for being here and listening. 3 weeks before that night in the park, everything had begun on the 40th floor of Shaw Tower. It was almost midnight. The main conference room of Shaw Capital was still lit. Barrett Shaw sat at the head of the table, his back resting against the chair, both hands placed on the glass surface. 6 people sat around the table, and not one of them dared to move. A senior assistant stood in the middle of the room, with his head lowered. He had just finished his report. The Western deal Barrett had assigned him to oversee had collapsed because of a mistake during the negotiation stage. Barrett didn't shout. He didn't slam his hand on the table. He only looked at the man with eyes that held nothing but stillness. Then he spoke, his voice calm, as if he were reading the weather. "You have 24 hours. Fix it, then come back. If you can't fix it, don't come back." The man nodded and walked out of the room. His hands were shaking, and sweat had soaked the back of his neck. The 6 people left behind sat perfectly still, their eyes fixed on the table. No one dared to look up. Barrett stood, dismissed, one word. The entire room rose in silence, gathered their things, and left. No one said goodbye. No one asked anything more. They knew the rule. When Barrett Shaw finished a sentence, the meeting was over. Barrett stepped out into the hallway on the 40th floor. At this hour, the building was completely empty. His shoes echoed against the stone floor. He walked slowly, both hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted slightly toward the glass windows overlooking the city. Chicago at night stretched beneath him like a glowing map. Barrett wasn't admiring it. He was only walking. Then he stopped. Light spilled out from the small conference room at the end of the hallway. That room was supposed to be dark. The afternoon meeting had ended long ago, and no one had any reason to still be there. Barrett pushed the door open and stepped inside. A young woman was sitting on the floor, her back leaning against the leg of the conference table. She wore a cleaning uniform, her hair tied neatly back, her canvas shoes faded with wear. On her lap was a stack of internal financial reports someone had forgotten to clear away after the meeting. Beside her were a mop bucket and a broom propped in the corner. She had already finished her work, but instead of leaving, she had stayed, reading. The young woman lifted her head and met Barrett's eyes. Everything froze for 1 second. She sprang to her feet, the stack of reports falling to the floor, papers spreading open around her. Her face went pale. "I'm sorry. I was only reading. I won't do it again." Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. Those eyes looked at Barrett for only a brief instant before lowering, but in that instant, there was something Barrett rarely saw in people standing before him. It wasn't pure fear. It was shame, the kind of shame that belongs to someone caught doing the thing they long for most. Barrett didn't say another word. The young woman hurriedly picked up the bucket and broom, then rushed toward the door. Her shadow disappeared beyond the bend in the hallway. Barrett remained still. He looked down at the floor, at the place where the young woman had just been sitting. The stack of reports lay scattered everywhere. But beside them, stuck to the floor, was a small note. Barrett bent down and picked it up. The handwriting was tiny and neat. It wasn't ordinary note-taking. That young woman had analyzed Shaw Capital's cash flow quarter by quarter, compared expenses across different periods, and circled the figures she believed were irregular. Beside each number was a short note, logical and clear. Not a single word wasted. Barrett read slowly. Then he read it again. He was a man who ran an empire. He had teams of accountants, lawyers, and financial specialists paid astonishing salaries. But the note in his hand at that moment, written by a young woman who mopped floors on the night shift with a ballpoint pen probably worth less than $1, showed him something that none of those teams had ever mentioned. Barrett folded the note carefully, then placed it in the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He left the conference room, turned off the lights, and closed the door. Then he walked down the hallway toward the elevator. Chicago still blazed beyond the glass windows. Barrett pressed the elevator button and waited. He didn't know that young woman's name. Not yet. But the note lay inside his jacket pocket, close to his chest, slowly warming with the heat of his body. And Barrett Shaw was the kind of man who never forgot a detail that made him read it a second time. The next morning, just as sunlight began slipping through the window frame, Marin opened the door to the shabby studio apartment on the south side of Chicago. She had just finished her night shift, her body heavy as if stones had been tied to it, but her steps were still quick. She didn't have time to be tired. Jolene was sitting on the bed, her back against the wall, her eyes open but seeing nothing. She was talking to the wall. Her voice was small, flat, and steady, and every now and then she giggled softly, as if she were speaking with an old friend only she could see. Marin set her bag down, poured warm water onto a towel, sat beside her mother, and wiped her face. Jolene stayed still. She didn't resist, but she didn't turn to look at her daughter either. Marin opened the pill box, took out 2 tablets, and placed them in her mother's palm. "Take your medicine, Mom." Jolene took them, put them into her mouth, and swallowed. Like a habit, her body still remembered, even though her mind had forgotten almost everything. Marin opened the cold meal box from the night before, scooped up a spoonful, and lifted it to her mother's mouth. Jolene ate slowly, her eyes still fixed on emptiness. Then she stopped. She turned to look at Marin, tilted her head, and narrowed her eyes, as if trying to recognize a familiar face. "Who are you?" Marin didn't stop moving. She scooped up another spoonful of rice and held it out. "I'm Marin, Mom, your daughter." Jolene nodded slowly, as though the answer sounded reasonable, though she didn't truly understand it. Her eyes were hollow, looking through Marin as if looking through glass. Then she turned back and continued talking to the wall. Marin didn't cry. She was used to this moment. It happened every day, as steadily as sunrise, and every day it still hurt like the first time. But she didn't have the right to stop and feel the pain. Once her mother had finished eating and lay down to rest, Marin sat on the windowsill and opened the only book she owned, Fundamentals of Corporate Finance, a hardcover with worn corners, a spine cracked lengthwise, and yellowed pages covered with notes in blue ballpoint pen. She hadn't bought that book. 5 years earlier, a woman named Patrice Dunham had given it to her. Patrice had once fed Marin, given Marin part-time work, and given Marin the belief that life could become something different. But then Patrice's shop closed because of debt. On the final day, Patrice placed the book in Marin's hands and said, "I can't help you anymore, but that head of yours is something no one can take away. Remember that." Then she left. Marin never saw her again. The book stayed. Marin read it until every page had grown frayed beneath her fingers. She wrote notes in the margins, marked important passages, and drew small diagrams beside the formulas. She read it again and again until she knew it by heart, until financial numbers became a second language, one she spoke more fluently than her mother tongue. But no one knew that. To the neighbors, she was the unfortunate daughter who had to care for her sick mother. To her coworkers, she was the quiet girl who mopped floors on the night shift and never spoke to anyone. To the landlord, she was the tenant who often paid late. No one looked at Marin and thought that inside her mind there was an analytical machine, sharper than those of many people who had graduated from prestigious universities. Marin closed the book. She stood, opened the medicine cabinet on the wall, and counted. There was enough left for her mother for about 2 weeks. After that, she didn't know. She looked over at the rent reminder taped to the refrigerator door. This month still hadn't been paid. Last month had been late too. The landlord had called twice. Marin drew in a breath, tightened her hair tie, put her jacket back on, and checked on her mother one last time. Jolene was asleep, her breathing even, her face strangely peaceful in sleep, as if in her dreams she was still the healthy woman she had been many years ago. Marin looked at her mother for one more second. Then she stepped out the door, locked it behind her, and walked toward the bus stop. In her coat pocket, she had nothing but a few coins and an old book, but inside her mind, there was an entire world no one had ever bothered to look into. At noon that day, Marin sat on a stone bench in a park 2 blocks from Shaw Tower. This was the only habit she had that belonged only to her. 30 minutes between shifts, before going home to take care of her mother and then returning to work through the night. She opened the finance book with the frayed spine, turned to the page marked by a folded corner, and read. A light wind moved through the row of maple trees. The park was quiet, with only a few joggers and an old woman feeding birds on the far side of the lawn. Marin didn't pay attention to anyone. She was mentally calculating a discounted cash flow formula when someone sat down at the other end of the bench. Marin glanced over. A young woman, probably in her early 20s, her hair tied in a ponytail, was staring at the thick textbook in her hands with a grimace on her face. The young woman sighed, turned a page, sighed again, and looked as if she almost wanted to throw the book onto the ground. A black SUV was parked about 50 meters away, the driver sitting motionless inside, occasionally glancing toward the bench. That was the agreement between this young woman and her brother. She was allowed to go out, allowed to have her own space. But someone was always watching from a distance. The young woman flipped through a few more pages, then looked up and glanced at the book Marin was holding. Her eyes widened. You read finance books? Voluntarily? Marin looked up, slightly surprised. She nodded. Yes. The young woman looked at the book in her own hands, then back at Marin's, her expression like she had just encountered some strange creature. Oh my God. I've got a microeconomics exam next week, and I've been reading this for a whole month and still don't understand anything. It's like reading in a language I haven't learned yet. And you're sitting here reading finance on your lunch break like it's a novel? Marin almost laughed. It's not exactly a novel. I'm serious. Look at this. The young woman opened the textbook and pointed to a chapter filled with graphs and formulas. Supply curves, demand curves, elasticity. When the professor explains it, I nod. Then I go home, open the book, and I don't understand a single line. I'm starting to think my brain just wasn't designed for this subject. Marin looked at the textbook. She turned a few pages and skimmed them. Then she said, her voice ordinary, as if she were talking to a neighbor. The problem isn't you. This book is written in an academic style. It uses too much terminology without explaining the foundation. Let me say it another way, and see if you understand. Marin began to explain. She didn't use formulas. She used examples. She talked about the price of coffee, about why one bakery could raise its prices and still stay crowded, while the bakery next door lowered its prices and remained empty. On a piece of paper she had picked up, she drew a simple diagram with the ballpoint pen in her coat pocket. She spoke slowly and clearly, and every time the other young woman looked confused, Marin used another example. 20 minutes later, the young woman sat up straight, her eyes lighting up. Wait. You're saying high elasticity means customers are sensitive to price. So if you lower the price, you can sell more. And low elasticity means even if the price goes up, people still buy it? That's right. So cigarettes have low elasticity because people are addicted? And they can't quit even when the price rises? Exactly. The young woman slapped her hand against her thigh. Oh my God. I spent a whole month reading this and couldn't understand it. You explained it in 20 minutes, and now I get everything. Why are you so good at teaching? What school do you teach at? Marin closed her book. I don't teach anywhere. The young woman looked at Marin and tilted her head, curious, but she didn't ask more. There was something in Marin's eyes that made her understand the story behind that answer wasn't meant to be told to a stranger. My name is Kennedy. The young woman held out her hand. Marin. Their hands touched. Kennedy smiled. A wide, easy smile. The kind of smile that belonged to someone who had just set down a burden. Marin only nodded lightly, but the corner of her mouth lifted a little. It had been a long time since she had sat and talked with anyone for that long. They didn't ask each other what they did for work, where they lived, or what their families were like. Neither of them said anything more about herself. They were just 2 women sitting on a park bench. One who knew too much and had no one to tell. The other who had too much and had no one who truly sat down beside her. Kennedy stood, hugging the textbook to her chest. She looked at Marin, a little hesitant. Will you be sitting here tomorrow? Marin looked at her. I sit here every day. Kennedy smiled again. Then she turned and walked toward the waiting black SUV. Marin watched until the young woman disappeared behind the row of trees. Then she opened her book again and turned back to the page she had left unfinished. But her eyes didn't look at the words. She was thinking about the smile of the girl named Kennedy, and she wondered when the last time was that someone had smiled at her like that. Kennedy kept her word. The next day, she was already sitting on the stone bench, holding her textbook and a bag of sandwiches she had bought from a shop near school. She handed one to Marin. Marin hesitated, but Kennedy pushed it into her hand and opened the textbook right away. Eat. Today we're studying Chapter 4. From that day on, they met every noon. 3 straight weeks, without missing a single day. Marin explained, and Kennedy listened. Marin drew diagrams on paper, and Kennedy took notes, then asked questions. Every day, Kennedy brought lunch and split it in 2. And every day, Marin accepted it without saying thank you out loud, only by staying a little longer, explaining more carefully, and being more patient. Kennedy's grades began to improve. On her midterm, she got her highest score ever. The professor asked whether she had hired a new tutor. Kennedy only smiled and didn't answer. It was the first time in Kennedy's life that someone had sat down beside her, not because of the Shaw name, not because they wanted access to her brother, not because of anything except that she needed help and the other person was willing to help her. One noon, after Marin finished explaining the money supply, Kennedy suddenly fell silent. She looked down at her textbook, her fingers turning the pen back and forth. Marin, you know, everyone around me only wants to get close because of my family. Friends, classmates, even people who say they like me. I know what they want. No one has ever sat down and taught me like this. No one has ever talked to me without first looking at what's standing behind me. Marin folded the notepaper. You're not stupid, Kennedy. You just need someone to explain it the right way. That's the teacher's fault, not yours. Kennedy looked at Marin. Her eyes were a little wet, but she blinked quickly and smiled. You make that sound so good. I want to write it down and tape it to my wall. Marin shook her head lightly, but this time, she truly smiled. Then one day, Marin didn't come. Kennedy sat waiting on the stone bench for 15 minutes, then half an hour, then 1 hour. No sign of her. The next day, Marin didn't come either. Kennedy texted her, but there was no reply. She called, but no one picked up. Her stomach tightened. She remembered Marin had once mentioned the neighborhood where she lived during a conversation, casually saying it was near the last bus stop on Route 6. Kennedy didn't know the exact address, but she searched. She walked along that street and asked a few people inside the grocery store. An old woman pointed her toward the old building at the end of the road. 3rd floor, last room down the hall. That girl is always carrying her mother up the stairs. Kennedy knocked on the door. There was silence for a while. Then the door opened. Marin stood there, dark circles under her eyes, her hair messy, her clothes wrinkled. She looked at Kennedy, and for a moment, both surprise and fear appeared on her face. Behind Marin, inside the small room, Jolene was sitting on the floor, clutching an old pillow tightly, rocking back and forth, her mouth singing a wordless melody. For the past 2 days, she had been in a severe episode, screaming, struggling, impossible to soothe. Marin hadn't slept, hadn't left her mother, had only sat beside her and held on to her to keep her from hurting herself in a fall. My mother is very sick, Marin said, her voice dry, as if she had prepared that sentence a long time ago. I'm sorry I didn't tell you first. She waited for Kennedy to step back, find an excuse to leave, say something polite, then disappear, just like everyone before her. But Kennedy didn't step back. She crossed the threshold, took off her shoes, and walked in. She sat down on the floor beside Jolene and gently placed her hand over the older woman's. Jolene stopped rocking. She looked at Kennedy with clouded eyes, stayed silent for a moment, then continued singing, but she didn't pull her hand away. Kennedy turned to Marin. Why didn't you tell me? Marin leaned back against the doorframe, her arms folded across her chest. What would be the point? Everyone leaves when they find out. Kennedy was still sitting on the floor, her hand still holding Jolene's. She looked at Marin, and there was no pity in her eyes, no curiosity, only a clarity that felt like a declaration. I'm not everyone. Marin didn't answer. She bit her lip and looked away, but the hand gripping her own elbow had loosened. That afternoon, Kennedy helped Marin clean the room, cooked porridge for Jolene, and stayed until the older woman fell asleep. When she was leaving, Kennedy stopped at the door and turned back to look at Marin. From now on, can I call you my big sister? Marin was surprised. Why would you call me that? Because I've never had a big sister, and I want one. Marin couldn't say anything. She only nodded. The door closed. Marin stood inside the small room, her mother asleep on the bed, the soft sound of rain outside the window. For the first time in a very long time, she felt that room become a little less empty, but there was something neither of them knew yet. Marin didn't know the young woman who had just called her big sister was the sister of the man at the head of the Shaw Empire, the most powerful man in the Chicago underworld. And Kennedy didn't know that the sister she had just chosen was the girl who mopped the 40th floor of her brother's building every night. During those first 2 weeks, while Marin and Kennedy were busy building their friendship on the park bench on the 40th floor of Shaw Tower, Barrett Shaw still hadn't forgotten the girl from that night. He called Grant Holloway into his office. Grant had been Barrett's right hand for 10 years, in charge of all of Shaw Capital's finances. He was the only person besides Barrett who had the right to access every set of books. Barrett pushed a piece of paper across the desk, with a name and employee number written on it. Find out about this person. Marin Cole. Night shift. Cleaning department. I want to know who she is. Grant took the paper, nodded, and didn't ask why. With Barrett Shaw, no one asked why. People simply did what they were told. 2 days later, Grant returned. He placed a short report on Barrett's desk. Marin Cole, 27 years old. Her mother is seriously ill, and they live together in a small apartment on the south side. No criminal record, no prior offenses, no connection to anyone or any organization, no degree. She's been working the night cleaning shift for nearly 2 years. She's just an ordinary floor cleaner. Nothing to worry about. Barrett looked at the report. He nodded, but said nothing. Grant waited a few more seconds, then understood that the conversation was over. He turned and left. In Grant Holloway's mind, the story ended there. A floor cleaning girl had secretly read a few papers. The boss had asked out of curiosity, and that was it. Nothing worth worrying about. It was the greatest mistake of Grant's life, though he didn't know it yet. That same week, Barrett received word that a group of business rivals across the city had begun pushing into territory controlled by the Shaw Empire. Barrett didn't hold a meeting. He didn't discuss it. He picked up the phone, made one call, and said no more than 3 sentences. The next morning, his assistant reported, "It's done." Barrett nodded and asked nothing else. That was how his world operated. One phone call could settle what other people needed an army to handle, but the note was different. The small note that girl had left behind on the conference room floor couldn't be handled with one phone call. It required patience. And Barrett Shaw, when necessary, was the most patient man in Chicago. He took out the note, placed it on the desk beside Shaw Capital's internal financial reports from the last 3 quarters, and began comparing them. The numbers Marin had written on that small piece of paper weren't random scribbles. She had tracked the company's outgoing cash flow over many months, reading a little each night from the files employees had forgotten to clear away, and she had pieced them together. The result was that she discovered an expense appearing regularly every month, always the same round amount, transferred to a company whose name she couldn't find in any contract or project mentioned in the reports. She had circled that number, written a question mark beside it, and calculated the total. Hundreds of thousands of dollars each quarter, disappearing into a name no one knew. Barrett looked at that number. Then he opened his computer, accessed the building's security camera system, and rewound the night shift footage. He watched. The first night, Marin mopped the 40th floor, cleaned the conference room, and gathered the documents neatly onto the table. When the work was done, she didn't leave. She sat down, opened the file, and read. She wrote notes with a ballpoint pen on a sticky note. 1 hour later, she stood, put the paper into her coat pocket, and left. The second night, exactly the same. The third night, exactly the same. Barrett fast-forwarded through dozens of nights. Every night followed the same routine. Mop the floor, clean up, sit down, read, write, never taking pictures, never using her phone, never carrying documents out of the room. She only read and stored it in her mind, wrote it down on paper, then carried that knowledge away with her. Barrett leaned back in his chair. The camera screen still showed Marin sitting on the conference room floor, her back resting against the leg of the table, her eyes fixed on the stack of papers, the ballpoint pen held between 2 fingers. She looked so focused that the entire world outside that room seemed not to exist. Barrett looked at that image longer than he needed to. Then he turned off the screen. He sat alone in the darkness of his office, his hands folded in front of him. This girl wasn't simple. The irregular payment she had discovered had been missed by his accounting team of 12 people, all highly paid, all working with specialized software, and not one of them had seen it. But a girl with no degree, sitting on the floor reading leftover papers every night, had seen it. Barrett didn't yet know who that number led to, but he knew one thing. This girl was either a danger or the most valuable thing he had accidentally picked up. And Barrett Shaw never overlooked anything that made him think for that long. 1 week after reviewing the camera footage, Barrett received a call from the person in charge of Kennedy's security. "Boss, I want to report something. Miss Kennedy has been meeting a woman in the park near Shaw Tower for the past few weeks. Every noon, same stone bench, same person. That woman seems to be teaching her something. I haven't interfered because Miss Kennedy seems comfortable, but I thought you should know." Barrett was signing documents at his desk. His hand stopped. "What woman? Describe her." "Late 20s, hair tied back, dressed simply, usually carries an old book. She sits on that bench every day before Miss Kennedy arrives." Barrett didn't need to hear more. He recognized her at once. That girl. He set the pen down and stayed silent for a few seconds. "What time do they meet?" "Around 12:30, boss. Every day." Barrett looked at the clock. 11:45. Prepare the car. 40 minutes later, Barrett was sitting in a black sedan parked a short distance from the park. He stepped out, brought no one with him, and walked into the park through the side path on the north. He stopped behind the row of maple trees, about 30 meters from the stone bench, and he saw them. Kennedy was sitting on the right end of the bench, her textbook open on her lap, a pen in her hand. She was taking notes, occasionally lifting her head to ask a question. Beside her, Marin sat with her body slightly turned, holding a sheet of paper, drawing a diagram and explaining in a gentle voice Barrett couldn't quite hear from that distance. But he saw enough. He saw Kennedy nod, then nod again, then saw her eyes light up in a way Barrett knew very well meant she had just understood something. He saw Kennedy laugh, turn to say something to Marin, and then both of them laughed together. Barrett stood still. How many tutors had he hired for Kennedy already? The best people, from the best schools, with fees large enough to pay 1 year of rent for an entire middle-class family. None of them had been able to teach Kennedy. She would sit and listen, nod politely, then go home and forget everything. The professors complained that she didn't focus. Kennedy said she didn't understand. Everyone blamed someone else. No one found a way. But here, on a stone bench in a park, a girl Grant Holloway had called nothing to worry about, was doing what all those expensive tutors had failed to do. Kennedy was learning, truly learning, and she was smiling while she learned. Barrett didn't count how long he stood there. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. He watched his sister smile, and he realized it had been a very long time since he had seen Kennedy that happy. Not the kind of happiness that came from being bought something new or taken to a fancy restaurant. It was the kind of happiness that belonged to a person who had just discovered she wasn't as stupid as she had believed. The kind of happiness money couldn't buy. Barrett turned around and walked back toward the car. He didn't approach the stone bench. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask Marin a single question. He didn't need to yet. Inside the car, he looked out through the window. Kennedy was still talking to Marin, both of their heads bent over the textbook. The guard sat in the driver's seat, waiting for an order. Barrett said, his voice calm, "Leave them alone, but don't take your eyes off them. If anyone approaches either of them, report to me immediately." "Yes, boss." The car left the park. Barrett sat motionless in the back seat, watching the city move backward past the window. In his mind, the pieces were fitting together. The girl who sat on the conference room floor every night reading reports. The girl who wrote financial analysis, notes sharper than his entire accounting team. The girl Grant had called nothing to worry about. And now, that same girl was sitting on a park bench teaching his sister, doing what a whole team of expensive tutors had failed to do. All of them were the same person. Barrett needed to know more, but he wasn't in a hurry. The man at the head of the Shaw Empire never acted before he had seen the whole board. He would wait, and while he waited, he would keep Marin Cole safe without her ever knowing it. Grant Holloway wasn't a fool. 10 years sitting beside Barrett Shaw had taught him something more important than any financial knowledge: how to read signs. And lately, there had been too many signs making him uneasy. Barrett had begun asking about internal financial reports more often than usual. He had asked the IT department to open access to the night shift security camera footage, something he had never cared about before. He stayed in his office later than usual, and one night, Grant saw the light in Barrett's office still on at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Grant didn't know exactly what Barrett was looking for, but the instinct of a man hiding a secret made him restless. He began to wonder. Was Barrett digging into the books? Had he discovered something already? Or was it only a routine check? Grant needed to know. He questioned the IT staff carefully, without making it obvious. The answer surprised him. Barrett wasn't looking at financial reports in the system. He was watching security footage from the 40th floor, the night shift, and he had asked Human Resources about a cleaning employee. Grant dug a little deeper. The night shift cleaning employee, the one he had reported to Barrett as nothing to worry about a few weeks earlier. Barrett was still interested in her. Why? Grant didn't know Marin had discovered the irregular payment. He didn't know about the note. He only knew one thing. That girl stayed behind after work and read internal documents, and Barrett had been interested in her long enough for Grant to start worrying. In Grant's mind, the calculation was very simple. This girl read financial documents every night. If she read long enough, and read enough, sooner or later she would see things she wasn't supposed to see. And if Barrett was paying attention to her, it meant the boss was starting to ask questions. The solution was to remove her from the building. Fast, clean, and without leaving a trace. Grant didn't need to think much. He called the cleaning company Shaw Tower outsourced its services to. One short phone call. He didn't give his name. He only mentioned that this was a request from building management. Reason for termination. Violation of rules. Staying in the office after working hours. Handle it immediately. No warning needed. The cleaning company didn't ask anything more. They had no reason to ask. The next morning, Marin had just finished her night shift and was getting ready to leave the building when the cleaning department manager called her into the office. He sat behind the desk and didn't look directly into her eyes. "Cole, we've received a report that you stayed in the office after working hours without a work-related reason. This is a serious violation of company rules. The company has decided to terminate your contract, effective immediately." Marin stood still. She didn't argue. She knew arguing wouldn't change anything. People had already made their decision, and she was only a name on a payroll sheet that no one would remember after it was erased. "Can I collect my personal belongings?" 5 minutes. Marin went to the employee locker. There wasn't much inside. A spare jacket, a pair of rubber gloves, and the ballpoint pen she used to take notes every night. She stuffed everything into a plastic bag, closed the locker, and walked out. She crossed the lobby of Shaw Tower for the last time. The revolving glass door pushed her out onto the sidewalk. The early morning wind blew cold. Marin stopped. She turned and lifted her head to look up. The 40th floor. The glass windows reflected the gray sky. She looked up at that place, where every night she had sat on the floor, reading, writing, learning, and believing she was building something. Then she turned her back and walked away. She didn't look back. That night, Barrett opened the night shift security footage out of habit. The hallway on the 40th floor was empty. The conference room was dark. No one was sitting on the floor. He rewound the footage, checked the previous night shift. Empty as well. He picked up the phone and called the building manager. "Marin Cole, night shift cleaning department. Where is she?" The manager's voice was slightly flustered. "She was terminated, Mr. Shaw. Violation of rules." "Who gave the order?" Silence. The manager couldn't answer. "I'm asking again. Who ordered her termination?" I received instructions from management. I'm not sure exactly who." Barrett hung up. He sat still in the darkness of his office. The termination order hadn't come from building management. People didn't fire a cleaning employee for staying behind to read papers unless someone wanted her to disappear. And that person was sitting inside his organization. Barrett knew it, but he didn't know who yet. And until he knew, he wouldn't act. Because if he revealed that he cared about Marin Cole, she wouldn't only lose her job, she would become a target. Barrett picked up the phone and called another number. "Marin Cole, I need someone watching her. Protect her from a distance. She mustn't know." On the first day without work, Marin woke at 5 in the morning out of habit. Her body hadn't yet understood that there was no longer any night shift to go to. She wiped her mother's face, gave her medicine, coaxed her into eating a few spoonfuls of porridge, then changed into the cleanest clothes she owned and stepped out into the street. She went to a small restaurant 2 bus stops away, where a sign was hanging in the window saying they were hiring a dishwasher. The manager looked her up and down and asked if she had restaurant experience. Maren said she could do anything, learned fast, and wasn't picky about hours. The manager flipped open his notebook and asked one more question. "Do you have a reference from your last job?" Maren went silent. She had been fired for violating company rules. No one wrote a reference for someone who had been dismissed. The manager closed the notebook. "Let me take a look. Leave your phone number and wait for a call." Maren knew what wait meant. It meant no. She walked another 6 blocks to a convenience store that needed someone for the night shift. This time, she said honestly that she had no reference and was willing to work unpaid for 3 days to prove herself. The person in charge looked at her, slightly surprised, then asked, "Do you have any qualifications?" "No, but I can do anything you need." That person smiled, the kind of smile Maren had seen too many times in her life. The kind of smile from someone who didn't believe her, but didn't want to seem cruel either. "Miss, everyone says that. Let me review it and contact you later." Maren stepped outside and stood on the sidewalk, watching the traffic move past. She wasn't angry. She didn't have the energy to be angry. She only stood there, calculating in her head. The rent was 2 months late. The landlord had called for the 3rd time last week, and his voice had begun to lose patience. Her mother's medicine cabinet had less than a week left. That medicine wasn't cheap, and no insurance covered someone without complete paperwork. Maren looked down at her feet. The sneakers she was wearing were the only intact pair she had left. She still had one old pair of house slippers at home. That afternoon, Maren took the sneakers to the thrift shop at the end of the street. The shop owner turned them over in his hands, checked the soles, then offered her a number. Maren didn't bargain. She took the money, went straight to the pharmacy, and bought enough medicine for her mother for 2 more weeks. On the way home, she walked in the thin house slippers, stepping over the cold sidewalk. She didn't think about the shoes. She thought about 2 weeks. In 2 more weeks, she had to find a way, or her mother wouldn't have medicine. That night was the worst night. Maren was sitting on the kitchen floor, eating cold instant noodles, when she heard a noise from the bedroom. Screaming. Jolene was screaming, her voice sharp, not forming any clear words, only the sound of terror that she had created inside her own mind. Maren ran in. Her mother was thrashing on the bed, her hands flailing wildly, her legs kicking at the blanket, her eyes wide open but seeing nothing in the real world. She was living inside a nightmare she didn't need to be asleep to enter. Mom, it's me." Maren wrapped her arms around her mother. Jolene tore herself away with unexpected strength, and they both fell to the floor. Maren didn't let go. She held on tightly, both arms around her mother's waist, her face pressed against Jolene's shoulder. Jolene kept screaming, kept struggling, her body rigid with panic. Maren didn't know what else to do. She began to sing. Softly, her voice trembled, her breathing broken because she was using all her strength to hold her mother. She sang the old song about someone being her sunshine and making her happy when the skies were gray. Jolene kept screaming. Maren kept singing, repeating the promise of love in the song until her voice broke on the last note. Tears ran down onto her mother's shoulder, but she didn't wipe them away. She had no hand free to wipe them. She only held on and sang the same song again and again. The first time, the second time, the third time. Slowly, Jolene softened. The screaming faded, became a moan, then became breathing. Her body loosened and collapsed into Maren's arms. She didn't sing along. She didn't say anything. But she stopped fighting. Her eyes closed. She slept. Maren sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her mother curled in her lap. The room became quiet again, with only Jolene's steady breathing and the drip of water from the kitchen faucet that Maren always forgot to tighten. Maren looked toward the medicine cabinet hanging on the wall. The medicine she had bought that afternoon was inside it. 2 weeks. After 2 weeks. Then what? She looked down at her mother. Jolene's sleeping face was strangely peaceful, with no trace left of the panic, as if she had just returned from somewhere very far away and had finally found her way home. Maren drew in one long, slow, deep breath. Then she thought, for the first time, not about medicine, not about money, not about work, but about herself. I don't know how much longer I can carry this. Only that one sentence. It passed through her mind like a cold wind slipping through a crack in the door. Then it was gone. Maren closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. She only sat still, holding her mother, until the first light of morning slipped through the curtains. When the room had fully brightened, Marin gently laid her mother back on the bed and covered her with the blanket. She stood, poured water, wiped her mother's face, gave her medicine. Then she changed her shirt, tied back her hair, slipped on the thin house slippers, and stepped out the door. She didn't know where she was going. She had no job, no money, and no one calling to schedule an interview. But she still stepped out the door. Because as long as she could still stand up, she hadn't lost yet. 3 days later, Marin sold her phone too. It was the last thing she still had that could be sold. The money was enough to buy her mother's medicine for 1 more week and a small bag of rice. She tucked the remaining money into her coat pocket, stepped out of the pawn shop, and realized that from that moment on, she had no way to contact anyone anymore. It didn't matter if no one called her. No one ever called. Except Kennedy. Kennedy texted Marin that afternoon. No one answered. She called. The number couldn't be reached. She called again. Still the same. Kennedy sat in her dorm room, staring at her phone, her stomach tightening. The last time Marin had disappeared for 2 days, it was because her mother had suffered a severe episode. This time, it had been 3 days. The park bench had been empty for 3 noons in a row. Kennedy couldn't wait any longer. Without wasting a single second, she took a car straight back to the old building, racing up to the 3rd floor where she knew Marin lived. But when she arrived, she didn't find Marin inside the apartment. She found Marin sitting in the hallway outside, in front of a door that had been locked with a new padlock, the kind landlords used when throwing tenants out. Beside the door, a handwritten note had been taped up. 2 months of rent owed. Unit reclaimed. Marin sat on the hallway floor, her back against the wall, her knees drawn up. Beside her, Jolene sat on the floor, clutching the old pillow she had managed to bring with her before being forced out, her mouth quietly singing a wordless melody, her eyes fixed on the empty space at the end of the hallway. In front of Marin was a plastic bag holding a few sets of clothes, a box of medicine, and the finance book with the frayed spine. That was everything the mother and daughter owned. Kennedy froze at the top of the stairs. She looked at the scene, and she understood everything at once, without needing anyone to explain. She ran over and sat down beside Marin. "Sister, Marin." Marin looked up. Her eyes were dry, with no tears in them. She had cried them all out. Or maybe she had forgotten how to cry. She looked at Kennedy, and for one brief moment, something appeared on the face of this sister Kennedy had never seen before. It wasn't shame. It wasn't despair. It was acceptance. The kind of acceptance that belongs to someone who has reached the end of the road and knows there is nothing left ahead. "My mother needs medicine, Kennedy. The medicine is almost gone. I have no money. I have no home. I don't know what to do." Marin's voice didn't shake. She spoke calmly, clearly, as if she were reading a report. But that calm was what frightened Kennedy the most, because it meant Marin had run out of hope so completely that she no longer had the energy to panic. Kennedy took out her phone. Her hand was trembling. She dialed the number she only called when she truly needed help. Her brother's number. The phone rang twice. Barrett answered. "Kennedy." "Brother." Kennedy's voice broke. She cried. "Brother, Marin has nowhere to stay. Her mother is very sick. The landlord threw them out. She's sitting in the hallway, brother. You have to help. You have to help her." The other end of the line went silent. 5 seconds. As long as 5 minutes. Then Barrett's voice came through, calm, without the slightest ripple. "Send me the address. I'm coming now." Kennedy sent the address, then sat beside Marin and wrapped her arms around her. Marin didn't hug her back. She only sat still, her hand still holding her mother's shoulder. 20 minutes later, the sound of a car stopping came from in front of the building, then footsteps on the stairs. Fast, steady, decisive. Barrett Shaw appeared at the end of the 3rd floor hallway. He wore a dark suit and leather shoes, looking completely out of place in the old building with its peeling walls. But he didn't look around. He looked straight toward the end of the hallway. Marin was sitting there, her back against the wall, her hand holding her mother. Jolene was still clutching the pillow, still singing, her eyes still looking toward someplace no one in that hallway could reach. Barrett walked over. He stopped 2 steps away from Marin. He looked at her, then at Jolene, then back at her. Marin lifted her head. She recognized him, the man from the 40th floor conference room that night, the owner of the building she had just been fired from. She didn't understand why he was here. But she didn't ask either. She no longer had the strength to ask. Barrett spoke first, his voice low. "How long have you been taking care of her alone?" Marin looked at him. "Since I was little." Barrett went silent for a beat. "Why didn't you ask anyone for help?" Marin didn't lower her face. She looked straight into the eyes of the most powerful man in Chicago, and she said only one word. "Who?" One word. Heavier than every story she could have told. Barrett didn't ask anything more. Barrett took out his phone, turned his back, and made a call. He spoke briefly, no more than 4 sentences. The name of the hospital, the address, the request for a private ambulance to come immediately, and instructions to prepare a long-term treatment room. Then he hung up and turned back to Marin. "I'll take your mother to the best hospital in the city. The doctors will examine and treat her today." Marin looked at him. She didn't stand. She didn't thank him. She only asked, her voice low but clear, "Why?" Barrett didn't answer right away. Kennedy sat beside her, her tears still not dry, looking back and forth between her brother and Marin. She wanted to say something, but she knew this wasn't the time. "Why?" Marin asked again. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. I don't accept charity." She said the last sentence almost on a breath, but every word was clear. She was sitting on a hallway floor, homeless, penniless, with her gravely ill mother beside her, and she was still refusing. Barrett looked at her. He had sat across from the most powerful people in Chicago, men who owed him billions, rivals willing to kill for territory. No one had ever looked at him the way Marin was looking at him now, not with defiance, not with fear, but with self-respect, the kind of self-respect that belongs to someone who has nothing left and still refuses to kneel. "This isn't charity," Barrett said. He spoke slowly, clearly, each word like he was signing a contract with his voice. "You discovered something my entire team didn't see. The notes you wrote on that little piece of paper that night, do you remember? You found an illicit cash flow in my company's books. Someone is taking money from me, every month, steadily, and none of my 12 accountants saw it. But you did." Marin was silent. She remembered. The numbers she had circled on the note, the repeated expense, the company with no name. She had thought that piece of paper had been thrown away long ago. "I need you to find out who is taking my money," Barrett said. "Not because I pity you, but because you have something I need." Marin looked at him. She understood. This wasn't kindness. This was a transaction. This man didn't give anyone anything for free. He was buying what she had, her mind, by paying a price she couldn't refuse, her mother's health. And the strange thing was, precisely because this was a transaction and not charity, Marin felt she could accept it. She was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said, "I have one condition." Barrett tilted his head slightly. No one set conditions with Barrett Shaw. But he didn't interrupt her. "My mother gets treatment until she recovers. No matter what happens to me, whether I find that person or not, even if I fail, my mother still gets treated. That is my only condition." Barrett looked at her. In 10 years in this world, he had heard every kind of condition. Money, power, position, protection. People always set conditions for themselves. This was the first time someone had set a condition without asking for anything for herself. No home, no salary, no guarantee of safety. Only a request that her mother be treated. Barrett nodded. Agreed. One word. But it was Barrett Shaw's word. And in this world, his word carried more weight than any contract. 15 minutes later, the private ambulance arrived. 2 medical workers came up to the 3rd floor, carrying a stretcher and equipment. They gently helped Jolene stand. She didn't resist. She was still clutching the pillow, still singing, still staring toward some place no one else could see. Marin stood beside her, her hand gripping the side of the stretcher as they brought her mother down the stairs. She followed them out to the vehicle. Jolene was placed onto the stretcher inside the ambulance. Marin stood at the door, looking at her mother. Jolene looked small inside the wide vehicle, her face peaceful as she sang. The old pillow still held tightly against her chest. The door closed. The ambulance drove away. Marin stood on the sidewalk, watching until it turned at the intersection at the end of the street and disappeared. She stood there for a few more seconds. Then she turned back. Barrett was standing beside the black sedan, both hands clasped behind his back, waiting. Kennedy stood beside him, her eyes still red, though she had stopped crying. Marin walked up to Barrett. She looked straight into his eyes. "When do I start?" Barrett answered without missing a beat. "Right now." The next morning, Marin entered Shaw Capital through the front entrance. The last time she had passed through this building, she had used the service employee door in the basement, wearing a cleaning uniform and carrying a mop bucket. Today, she wore the clothes Kennedy had bought for her the night before. Simple, clean, and fitting her well. She took the elevator up to the 40th floor. When the elevator doors opened, she stepped out and walked straight toward Barrett's office. The whispering began before she even had a chance to sit down. A female employee standing by the coffee machine turned to her coworker, her voice loud enough for Marin to hear. "Isn't that the night shift floor cleaner? Why is she up here?" The coworker glanced toward Marin and frowned. A senior employee sitting nearby looked up, watched Marin walk past, then turned back to his desk with a smirk he didn't even bother to hide. Marin heard everything. She didn't turn around. She didn't explain. She didn't look at anyone. She walked straight into the room Barrett had arranged for her, a small desk in the corner right beside his office, sat down, opened the stack of ledgers that had been prepared, and began working. That afternoon, Barrett called a full financial meeting with the entire team. 14 people sat around the large conference table on the 40th floor. Marin sat in the chair at the back of the room, close to the wall, with no seat at the table. She held a notebook on her lap and stayed silent. The issue that day was a loss in the third quarter cash flow that no one could explain. Figures from 3 different departments contradicted one another. The head of accounting blamed operations. Operations blamed accounting in return. A third person offered a theory, only to have it rejected by the other 2. 30 minutes passed. The voices in the room grew louder and louder, and no one came any closer to an answer. Barrett sat at the head of the table, silent the entire time. He didn't interrupt anyone. He only listened. Then he looked toward the back of the room, where Marin was sitting. "Do you have an opinion?" 14 heads turned to look. The employee who had smirked that morning was sitting in the middle of the table. Surprise flashed briefly in his eyes, then shifted into an expectant look. The kind of expectation that waited to watch someone embarrass herself. Marin didn't stand. She stayed where she was, her notebook open on her lap, her voice small, but every word clear. She began to speak. She pointed out that the figures from the 3 departments weren't contradictory in the way everyone thought. The problem was in how the expense had been classified. One cost was being recorded under 2 different categories in 2 departments, causing the numbers to fall out of alignment when they were consolidated. She identified exactly what the expense was, which line it appeared on, and the way to fix it by reclassifying it under one unified system. 5 minutes. She spoke for 5 minutes. The conference room went completely silent. The head of accounting opened his mouth, then closed it again. The employee who had smirked that morning looked down at the table. No one said anything more. Barrett stood. "Continue." Then he walked out of the room. No praise, no nod, no looking back. But all 14 people in that room understood one thing. Barrett Shaw had just asked that girl for her opinion in front of everyone. And when she finished speaking, he didn't need to hear from anyone else. That was how Barrett acknowledged a person. That night, Kennedy texted Marin. "I heard you made the whole conference room shut up today." "You're a legend," Marin replied. "I only said what I saw." Late that night, Marin sat in the workroom beside Barrett's office, the desk lamp the only source of light. She opened the ledgers and followed the trail of the irregular payment she had first discovered during those nights, reading reports on the conference room floor. Now she had full access. She traced the money. The monthly payment flowed into one company. That company was linked to another, and then to another after that, a chain of shell companies. Everything led in the same direction. But she still didn't have enough data to name the final person. She needed more time. Marin leaned back in her chair and looked around the room. The desk lamp cast light across the wall, the bookshelf, and Barrett's desk. On his desk, beside a stack of documents, there was a small framed photograph. A woman in the picture had a gentle smile and dark brown hair. Marin looked at the photograph, but she didn't ask. She had no right to ask about Barrett Shaw's life. But Kennedy told her. She brought Marin late-night food, set it on the desk, and noticed Marin looking at the photograph. Kennedy said softly, "That's his mother. She died when he was 16. That's why he protects me the way he does." Then Kennedy said nothing more. Marin didn't ask anything more either. She turned back to the ledgers, and the 2 sisters sat together in that late-night office, one eating, one reading numbers, in a silence that didn't need to be filled. Grant Holloway couldn't sleep for 2 nights in a row. The floor-cleaning girl he had gotten fired was now sitting inside the Shaw mansion, working right beside Barrett's office, with access to the books that previously only he and Barrett had been allowed to see. He heard employees whispering about that girl. He heard about the meeting the previous afternoon, about how her analysis had made the entire room fall silent, about the way Barrett had stood and said, "Continue," before walking out. Grant understood. She wasn't here only to teach Kennedy or to serve as an assistant. She was digging into the books, and if she dug deep enough, she would find him. He didn't have much time. He needed to act immediately, and this time, he couldn't simply fire her. He needed Barrett to remove her with his own hands. Grant spent one night setting the trap. He created a new email account using the name Maren Cole, registering through a free email service that didn't require identity verification. From that account, he sent 3 internal financial files from Shaw Capital to an outside email address, one he had also created himself, but named to resemble a rival company. Once he was done, he printed the sent email history, attached screenshots, and bound everything into a neat file. The next morning, Grant walked into Barrett's office. He placed the file on the desk, his expression grave. "Barrett, I found a problem. The new girl, Maren Cole. She's sending internal documents outside the company. Here's the proof, an email under her name, sending files to an address outside the company. I think she's selling information." Barrett looked at the file. He didn't open it right away. He looked at Grant. Then he looked back at the file. Then he opened it and read, slowly. He said nothing. Grant stood waiting, his heart beating faster than usual, but his face remained calm. 10 years of performing in front of Barrett had taught him how to control his expression. "All right," Barrett said. "I'll handle it." Grant nodded and left the room. He thought he had won. 1 hour later, Maren was sitting and analyzing the books when Barrett's office door opened. An assistant stepped out and looked at her. "Mr. Shaw wants to see you. Right now." Maren stood, picked up her notebook, and walked in. Barrett's office was darker than usual. The curtains were drawn. The desk lamp was the only source of light. Barrett sat behind the desk. Behind him, 2 men stood close to the wall, arms crossed over their chests, faces expressionless. Maren recognized them. Barrett's men, not office employees. Her stomach tightened. Barrett didn't look up. He pushed the file across the desk toward Maren. "Explain." Maren set her notebook down, picked up the file, and opened it. She read. An email under her name. Financial files she had once read, sent to an address she had never seen before. Her face went pale. "I didn't do this." Barrett lifted his eyes. They were cold. "I brought you into my house. I gave you access to the books. I trusted you." Maren placed the file back on the desk. Her hand trembled slightly, but her voice didn't. "I didn't send this email. I don't know this account. I've never contacted anyone outside the company." Barrett looked at her in silence, waiting. The 2 men behind him shifted slightly. Maren could feel the air in the room becoming heavier. She understood that in this room, one wrong answer could make her disappear. But she didn't lower her head. She looked straight at Barrett and said, "If you've already decided I'm guilty, why are you still asking?" The 2 men behind Barrett stepped forward. Barrett raised his hand. They stopped. He still didn't turn to look at them. He only lifted his hand, and they froze as if they had struck an invisible wall. The room locked into stillness. "Because I want to hear you say it." Maren drew in a breath. "You can check every device I've used. I don't have my own computer. I don't have a phone because I sold it before I came here. Everything I do is in the room next door, under your cameras, on your computer. If I wanted to betray you, I wouldn't be sitting here facing you." Silence. Barrett looked at her for 10 seconds. The longest 10 seconds of Maren's life. Then he said, "Leave the room. I'll verify it." Maren stood, picked up her notebook, and walked out. She didn't turn back. She didn't run. She walked at a normal pace, even though her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. But there was one thing Maren didn't know. Barrett didn't need to verify anything. His information technology team had checked that email account the moment Grant brought him the file. They had found that the account had been created from an IP address unrelated to Maren, unrelated to any device she had ever used. The email was fake. Barrett had known before. He called Maren into the room. He didn't need her to prove her innocence. He needed something else. He needed to see how she reacted when she was backed into a corner. If she panicked, begged, or cried, he would have doubted her more. A truly innocent person isn't always calm. But the kind of calm Marin had just shown, the kind that looked straight into the eyes of the most powerful man in the room and asked why he was still asking, wasn't the calm of a liar. It was innocence. Barrett leaned back in his chair. He knew Marin hadn't betrayed him, and he knew someone inside his organization had just tried to frame her. The question was no longer whether Marin could be trusted. The question was this: who was so afraid of her that they had to do this? Out in the hallway, Kennedy ran over when she saw Marin step out. "Sister, what happened? Why is your face so pale?" Marin looked at Kennedy, her voice even. "Someone is playing me, Kennedy. Someone forged evidence to make Barrett think I betrayed him. If your brother doesn't find that person, I'll find them myself." That night, Marin didn't sleep. She sat in the workroom and opened every note she had made from the first day. She traced the chain of shell companies again, but this time, she searched from another direction. She no longer asked where the money was going. She asked who had the authority to create those expenses, who had the access passwords, who signed off on them. The trail narrowed, from dozens of people down to a few, then to one: Grant Holloway. Marin wrote everything down, every number, every date, every transaction, every shell company, and the link between them. She wrote until her hand ached, until the desk lamp began to fade against the first morning light slipping through the curtains. She folded the stack of papers, walked into Barrett's office, placed it in the center of his desk. Then she returned to her own room, sat down in the chair, and waited. Barrett arrived at the office earlier than usual. He stepped into his study and saw the stack of papers lying in the center of his desk, exactly where Marin had placed it before dawn. He sat down, opened it, and read. Every page, every number, every transaction date, every shell company name linked to the next like a chain. Every link fitting perfectly, nothing extra, nothing missing. And at the end of that chain, there was only one name: Grant Holloway. Barrett finished reading. He set the papers down. He wasn't surprised. Somewhere deep inside, he had suspected it from the moment the order to fire Marin came from inside his own organization, and no one admitted to it. From the moment the fake email file landed on his desk, too perfectly timed, too neatly arranged, as if someone had prepared it in advance and was only waiting for the right moment to strike. But suspicion was one thing. Seeing proof was another. 10 years. Grant Holloway had been beside him for 10 years. From the days when the Shaw Empire didn't even have a name, when Barrett was still sitting in a tiny rented room on the west side, counting every dollar, Grant was the first person he trusted, the first person he gave the safe key to, the only person who knew the passwords to every account. 10 years. Barrett called his assistant in. "Prepare the transfer documents for all assets belonging to these companies." He read out the name of every shell company Marin had listed. "Transfer them back to Shaw Capital. I need the paperwork completed before 9 o'clock tonight." The assistant nodded and didn't ask. 9 o'clock at night. The 40th floor, Shaw Tower, was empty. Most of the employees had gone home. The hallway was dark, with only the automatic lights coming on when someone passed through. Barrett sat in his office, alone. On the desk in front of him were two things: the pages Marin had written and the completed transfer documents. His phone rang. His assistant reported, "Grant Holloway has arrived, boss. Send him in." Footsteps sounded in the hallway. The office door opened. Grant walked in. He wore a suit, his tie straight, his face calm. 10 years of performing in front of Barrett had made him a good actor, but he didn't know that today was his final performance. Grant looked around the room. Only Barrett was there. No one else. The door closed. He sat down in the chair across from him. "You called me in so urgently. What's going on?" Barrett didn't answer that question. He placed his hand on the stack of papers and pushed it across the desk toward Grant. 10 years, Grant." Grant looked at the papers. He hadn't opened them yet, but something in Barrett's voice made him stiffen. "For 10 years I gave you the books, the passwords, my trust. I gave you what I've never given anyone else in this world, and you repaid me with this." Grant opened the stack. He read the first page. His face didn't change. He turned to the second page, still calm. The third page, the fourth. By the fifth page, he stopped. His fingers trembled slightly. "Barrett, I don't know who gave you this, but this is a misunderstanding. These numbers can be explained. Those companies are auxiliary partners, set up to optimize cash flow. Barrett let him talk. He sat still, both hands folded in front of him, his eyes never leaving Grant's face. Grant kept talking, explaining, justifying, offering reasons. His voice was still steady, still professional, still full of the confidence of a man who had deceived the system for many years. Barrett waited until he finished. Then he turned through Marin's notes page by page, slowly, and read each number aloud. The January expense. $320,000. Transferred into Company A. Company A transferred it onward to Company B. Company B withdrew cash through a personal account, whose account holder was a relative of Grant Holloway. He kept reading. February, March, April. The same model, the same path, the same destination. With every month Barrett read aloud, Grant's face went another shade paler. By the time Barrett finished, Grant had nothing left to say. Barrett placed the transfer documents on the desk, directly in front of Grant. Sign. Transfer all assets from the shell companies back to Shaw Capital. Everything. Not $1 missing. Grant looked at the papers. His hand shook. He picked up the pen and hesitated. Barrett said, his voice neither rising nor falling, "Don't make me ask twice." Grant signed. Page after page, line after line, the pen trembled, but the signatures were still clear. When the final page had been signed, Barrett stood. He walked around the desk and stopped right beside Grant. Grant didn't lift his head. Barrett bent down and spoke softly, only loud enough for the two of them to hear. "You're still alive because you were once my brother. But if I see your face in Chicago again, you'll lose more than what you just signed back." Grant stood. He didn't look at Barrett. He went to the door and stepped into the hallway. Outside in the hall, Marin was standing at the far end, beside the door to her workroom. She hadn't been able to hear anything behind that closed door, but she saw Grant Holloway come out. His face was deathly pale. His eyes were lowered to the floor. He walked past Marin without looking at her, without stopping, without turning back. His steps were fast and uneven. Then he disappeared into the elevator. The elevator doors closed. Marin stood still. She understood. She didn't need anyone to explain what had just happened behind the door. In this world, she didn't need to know the details. She only needed to know that it was done. Barrett stepped into the hallway. He saw Marin. He said nothing. He walked to the bench beside the window and sat down. Marin looked at him for a while. Then she walked over and sat beside him, a handspan away. The hallway was silent. Chicago glowed beyond the glass. Barrett stared straight ahead. "You were right." Marin looked straight ahead too. "I know." Silence. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Then Barrett spoke. His voice softer than Marin had ever heard it. So soft that she wouldn't have heard him if she hadn't been sitting close. "I am sorry. I doubted you." Marin turned to look at him. Barrett Shaw had just said the 3 words he had probably never said to anyone else in his life. The 3 words that, in the world he lived in, people considered weakness. But he said them. To her. "Don't apologize," Marin said, her voice calm, though her eyes were warm. "Trust me. From now on." Barrett nodded, a slow, heavy, decisive nod. Then he stood and walked into his office. He picked up the stack of papers Marin had written, opened his private drawer, and placed them inside. Beside the small note he had picked up from the conference room floor on the first night, he closed the drawer and locked it. 2 pieces of paper lay beside each other in the dark. The first was the moment he discovered Marin Cole. The second was the moment he believed her. 2 months passed. Jolene was treated at one of the best private hospitals in Chicago. Her room was clean, with a window overlooking a garden, nurses on duty, and specialists checking on her every day. For the first time in her life, Jolene Cole was being properly cared for. She became more stable. The screaming episodes gradually decreased. She could sleep through the night, eat 3 meals a day, and sometimes she sat by the window for hours, quiet, watching the leaves move outside without fear. But she still didn't recognize Marin. Every week, when Marin came to visit, Jolene looked at her daughter with gentle but empty eyes, as if she were looking at a kind stranger who often came to sit beside her. She didn't call Marin's name. She didn't ask, "Is that you, my child?" She didn't hold her daughter's hand the way she once had. Marin said nothing about it. Each time she came, she sat beside her mother, told her stories, wiped her hands, combed her hair, and then went home. She didn't complain. She didn't ask the doctor when her mother would remember. She only came, sat, and loved her through presence. Today was the 8th visit. Marin pushed open the hospital room door and stepped inside. Jolene was sitting by the window, her back straight, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes looking out at the green space beyond the glass. She was strangely quiet, not singing, not speaking to anyone invisible, just sitting, breathing, and looking. Marin pulled a chair over and sat beside her. "Hi, Mom." Jolene didn't turn around. Marin wasn't hurt. She was used to it. She began telling a story, her voice soft, as if she were speaking more to herself than to her mother. "You know, when I was 8 years old, I cooked rice for the first time. You were sleeping, and I wanted to surprise you. I put the pot on the stove, poured in the rice, added water, and turned on the flame. But I forgot to turn the heat down. I ran off to find salt, and when I came back, black smoke was everywhere. The rice was burned black and stuck to the bottom of the pot. I was so scared, I cried. You woke up, ran into the kitchen, looked at that blackened pot, and then you laughed. You burst out laughing. You hugged me, laughing while you said, 'My girl is so talented. Next time remember to watch the fire.'" Marin stopped. She looked at her mother. Jolene was still looking out the window. She didn't turn back. She didn't smile. She didn't react. It was as if the story had drifted past her without touching anything inside. Marin swallowed. She looked down at her own hands, both resting on her lap, exactly like her mother's. She wanted to say more, but she didn't know what else to say. She had told every story she could remember, every memory, every broken piece of the life the two of them had shared that she had managed to keep. Not one piece had reached her mother. The hospital room was silent. The clock on the wall ticked softly. A light wind moved outside the window. Marin drew in a breath. Then she sang, softly, almost in a whisper. She sang the old song about sunshine, the one that called someone her only light. Her voice wasn't beautiful. It was a little hoarse, a little unsteady, the way it always was when she sang this song. The song she had sung to her mother on the worst night, on the floor of the old apartment, when her mother was screaming and she had no idea what else to do except hold her tightly and sing. She sang about gray skies, about happiness, and about a love too deep to be fully known. Jolene stopped. She was still looking out the window, but she stopped. Not like someone who had lost focus, like someone who had just heard something from very far away, from very long ago, from a place she had thought she had left forever. Jolene turned her head, slowly. She looked at Marin, and her eyes, for the first time in many years, were clear, not clouded, not panicked, not looking through her, looking straight at her, looking at Marin's face, looking as if she could see. "Marin?" One word, a whisper. Her voice was rough and weak, but clear. So clear that Marin stopped singing. She stopped breathing. She looked at her mother, and she saw the thing she had been waiting for all these years. Her mother was looking at her, truly looking at her, seeing her, remembering her. Marin broke. She wrapped her arms around her mother, both hands crossing behind Jolene's back, her face buried in her shoulder, and she cried, not softly. She cried so hard her body shook, so hard she couldn't say a single word, so hard that every pain she had swallowed for all those years poured out at once through the tears, soaking the shoulder of her mother's hospital gown. Jolene sat still. She placed a hand on her daughter's head. Her hand trembled, but the gesture was gentle and slow, like the hand of a mother soothing her child to sleep. She stroked Marin's hair softly and whispered, "My daughter, how did you grow so big?" Marin cried harder. She held her mother tighter. She wanted to say, "I've missed you." Wanted to say, "Mom, I'm here." Wanted to say a million things she had carried inside her chest for so long. But she couldn't speak. She only cried, and Jolene only stroked her hair, and the song still seemed to linger somewhere in the room, though no one was singing anymore. Outside the hospital room door, Kennedy stood in the hallway, her back against the wall. She had come with Marin today. She heard the singing, then she heard the crying. She looked through the small glass window in the door and saw Marin holding her mother, saw Jolene stroking her daughter's hair. Tears ran down Kennedy's face, and she didn't bother wiping them away. Barrett stood beside his sister. He heard it too. He didn't look through the glass. He only stood there, both hands clasped behind his back, his eyes lowered to the hospital floor. He didn't go into the room. That moment didn't belong to him. 5 minutes later, the door opened. Maren stepped out. Her eyes were swollen and red. Her nose was red. Her face was wet. But she was smiling. A thin, soft smile. The kind that belongs to someone who has just survived a storm and seen the sun. Kennedy hugged her. Maren hugged her back. Barrett stood beside them, not hugging, not speaking. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, took out a white handkerchief, neatly folded, and gave it to Maren. Maren took it. She wiped her tears, then looked at the handkerchief. In the corner, the letter M was embroidered in dark blue thread, hand-stitched, old but still clear. Maren looked at that letter. Then she looked at Barrett. She understood. Kennedy had told her. Margaret, his mother, the handkerchief he had kept for so many years, and he had given it to her, here, now, without saying a word. Maren held the handkerchief tightly in her hand. She looked at Barrett. He said nothing. He only gave a slight nod. Then he turned away and walked down the hospital corridor, his figure slowly disappearing around the bend. Maren stood there, the handkerchief embroidered with the letter M in her hand, her eyes still wet, but her heart warmer than it had ever been in all her 27 years. 6 months later, Maren Cole sat at the desk at the end of the 40th floor hallway in Shaw Tower. But it was no longer the small desk beside Barrett's office. She was sitting in her own office, the room that, 6 months earlier, had belonged to Grant Holloway. Barrett appointed her as financial manager after she completed the restructuring of the entire bookkeeping system, erased every trace of the shell company chain, and rebuilt the cash flow control process from the ground up. No one in the company objected, not because they loved Maren, but because after that meeting, no one dared to underestimate her anymore. In the evenings, 3 days a week, Maren went to school. She enrolled in an evening bachelor's program in finance at a local college, paying her own tuition from her salary. She sat in class with people 5 or 6 years younger than her, and she took notes diligently, just as she had once written on sticky notes, with a $1 ballpoint pen on the conference room floor. Kennedy had graduated from college the previous month. The final essay she submitted was titled, "The Sister Not Bound by Blood." Her professor gave her the highest grade in the class. One afternoon, Kennedy sat beside Maren in the garden of the Shaw estate and read a passage aloud to her. "She taught me that being smart isn't about knowing a lot. It's about not giving up when no one has believed in you yet." Maren shook her head and smiled. "You made me sound too good. I'm not like that." Kennedy looked at her sister, her eyes bright. "You're more than that." Jolene had been discharged from the hospital 2 months earlier. She lived in a small, clean apartment near the hospital, with someone caring for her every day. She hadn't fully recovered. There were still days when she talked to the wall, still nights when she sang a song without words. But each time Maren came to visit, she turned to look at her daughter and said, her voice light as wind, "My daughter is so beautiful." Every time Maren heard that sentence, she smiled, and every time she smiled, her eyes grew wet. This afternoon, Maren and Kennedy sat on a stone bench in the estate garden, talking, not about finance or economics, just two sisters chatting, laughing, and sharing a cup of tea. On the second-floor balcony, Barrett stood looking down. No one knew how long he had been standing there. Then he walked down into the garden and went straight to Maren. He was holding a white envelope, and he handed it to her. Maren looked at the envelope, then at him. "What's this?" "Open it." Maren opened it. Inside was a transfer acceptance letter to the prestigious Honors Finance program at the University of Chicago, complete with a full scholarship. It was a massive upgrade from the local college she had been attending, granted only to outstanding candidates, specially nominated by the university. Maren's hands trembled. She looked at the letter, then at Barrett. "Why did you do this?" Barrett looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't put a hand on her shoulder. He only said, his voice calm as always, but every word heavy, "Because you're the only person who walked into my world without wanting anything from it. You deserve it." Maren held the letter tightly. She looked straight into Barrett's eyes. "I won't waste it." Kennedy jumped up and wrapped her arms around Maren, laughing out loud. Maren hugged her back, and this time she hugged tightly, hugged for a long time, like someone who had finally begun to believe she deserved to be held. Barrett stood beside them. He didn't hug. He nodded, a slow, heavy nod, like the one he had given on the night he said, "I'm sorry," in the 40th floor hallway. For Barrett Shaw, a nod already meant a great deal. Then he turned, climbed the steps, and returned to the balcony. From there, he looked down into the garden, where Kennedy was pulling Marin by the hand and running in circles, laughing as if she had never been allowed to laugh before. And Marin, the girl who had once sat on the conference room floor at 2 o'clock in the morning, secretly reading papers under the hallway light, the girl who had once sold her last pair of shoes to buy medicine for her mother, the girl who had once sung "You Are My Sunshine" on a cold floor in the darkest night of her life, was now standing in the garden, beneath the sunlight, holding an admission letter in her hand, and smiling. For the first time, there was no worry behind that smile. No one is born to be forgotten. Sometimes, the only thing standing between a person and their future is a door no one has opened yet. And kindness doesn't always wear beautiful clothes. Sometimes, it comes from the places we least expect. Marin Cole's story ends here. Thank you for staying and listening until the very last minute. If this story has touched your heart, please press the like button and share this video with the people you love. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a comment below and share the feelings from deep inside your heart. We'd truly love to listen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next meaningful stories every day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.